Can there be two properties that are coextensive? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. We are asking the question, what are properties? And recently we saw class nominalism said to have a property is just to be the member of a class, where a class is just a collection of its members. That's all the class is. And two classes are identical if they have the same members, and there's nothing else to be said about why you would be a member of a class. You know, you don't have any kind of extra thing that puts you into a class. You just are in a class, and if you're in that class, then you have the property that's associated with that class. But having that property is not something extra. It's just being part of the class. That's all it means. So when I say that you are red, what I mean is you're just a member of the class of red things. I don't mean that you actually have redness in you or anything like that. I just mean you're part of the red class. Resemblance nominalism, which is something that we were supposed to talk about right after class nominalism, just goes a little bit further and says there is a reason why you are in the classes that you're in. It's because you resemble the other things that are in that class. So the reason you would be in the class of red things is because you resemble them insofar as you are red. So I told you after the class nominalism video I was going to talk about resemblance nominalism, and I totally forgot there's this very important objection to class nominalism, which also affects resemblance nominalism, that we'll talk about today. Remember that classes are identical if they are coextensive. What I mean by that is all a class is the members that make up the class. So let's say you have class A, and class A is just Larry, Moe, and Curly. That's all it is to be class A, is just Larry, Moe, and Curly. And class B, let's say, also has Larry, Moe, and Curly, and that's all class B has, Larry, Moe, and Curly. Well, that would mean that class A just is class B, because all it is to be those classes is to be, to have those members, and they have the exact same members, so they are identical. And remember that for class nominalism and also for resemblance nominalism, in order to have a property, or what it means to have a property, is just to be a member of a class. So classes are identical if coextensive, if they have the same members. That would then mean that properties would be identical if they are had by the exact same objects, right? If Larry, Moe, and Curly have property A, and Larry, Moe, and Curly have property B, and that's the only objects that have property A and property B, then property A would be identical to property B. But that seems like a problem, right? Couldn't we have properties that are had by the exact same objects but be different properties? This is called the coextension problem, and it is most famously supported by the counterexample of having a heart and having a kidney. The property of having a heart and the property of having a kidney. Everything that has a heart has a kidney, and everything that has a kidney has a heart. Therefore, the property having a heart and the property having a kidney are coextensive, right? All the same objects that have a heart have a kidney, and vice versa. So that would mean that they're in the same classes of things, right? Class A is the class of things that have a heart. Class B, class of things that have a kidney. And those are the identical classes because they have the same exact members. But the property of having a heart is not identical to the property of having a kidney, right? Well, then that would mean that being a property must not be the same thing as being a class, because classes are identical if they're coextensive, but it seems like properties aren't. So how is a class nominalist to respond to this kind of an objection? Well, one pretty bizarre way they've responded is by saying that, well, I'm sticking to my guns, and now I'm saying that having a heart and having a kidney are the same property. Yep, they just are identical properties. And that seems like a pretty extreme response, right? It seems pretty obvious that the property of having a heart and the property of having a kidney are two different things. So it seems like that kind of a response is just got to be wrong-headed, right? That's just a pig-headed kind of a response. A second response you could give is to provide a counterexample to the counterexample and say, nuh-uh, it's not the case that these are coextensive properties. There is an animal that has a heart but not a kidney, a flatworm. So flatworms do have something that operates like a kidney. And I mean, I guess you could just call it a kidney and say, yes, they do have a kidney. But let's say this response is legit. Does this adequately respond to the objection? Probably not. The idea is more like it's possible to have coextensive properties, not necessarily that this is the coextensive property. And you could respond by doing this too. Let's say we went out and we killed all the flatworms. And now it's true that all the animals that have, or all things that have a heart also have a kidney, and therefore the properties are coextensive. There you go. The point about the possibility of these properties, though, brings up a third reply that we could give, which is that based on modal realism. So if you don't know what modal realism is, check out my video on that. But the basic idea is this. Take any possibility in the world, right? Take all the facts about the world and compile them up into one big list, and then anything that could possibly be different, change that thing. You have a new possible world, right? And that possible world, modal realism says, actually exists somewhere, right? It really exists in the same way as the actual world exists. The actual world being this world, right? So this world and all possible worlds exist in the exact same way. So when we say, for example, possibly this sweatshirt could have been blue, there is a possible world out there that this sweatshirt is actually blue, right? It actually exists as blue. This world is really there, and there's a person that looks identical to me and has all the same properties as I do, and has a sweatshirt that's exactly the same as this sweatshirt, but it's blue. That's what it means to say that a sweatshirt possibly could be blue. So now, to say that everything that has a heart has a kidney, that those are coextensive properties, is not necessarily going to be true if we take into account all the possible worlds that there are. It's possible for an animal to have a heart but not have a kidneys. It just happens to not be the case, assuming that we kill off all the flatworms, right? So that means that there is a world out there that exists where there is some animal that has a heart and does not have kidneys. So those two properties then are no longer coextensive, right? If we're taking into account all those animals included. So that means that the properties are no longer coextensive, and this objection, remember, the objection was that, classes are being identical, are totally predicated on having the same members, the exact same members, and properties are just classes. So properties would be identical if they have the same members. And now all of a sudden we're looking and we see, well, these properties that seem to be different properties, but also seem to have the same members, we can't have that, right? Oh, but look, in another possible world, they don't have the same members. So that, and we're including that world in our predication here of this property. So these properties are now all of a sudden no longer coextensive. So we can say that they're two different properties. And if you'll remember in my video on modal realism, I told you that one of the reasons people posit modal realism is because it's very explanatorily useful. And here is one of the examples, right? You can use it in this case to explain how we could have, how class nominalism could be true, even though you have this coextensive problem, right? It can solve the coextension problem. Of course, one of the huge drawbacks is modal realism itself, right? You have to believe in this nearly infinite amount of possible worlds that actually exist. And that seems a little crazy. Another possibility, though, another possible problem is, granted that we have these possible animals out there that let us account for having a heart but not having kidneys, couldn't there also be properties that across all possible worlds, if you have one property, then you have the other one, and vice versa, right? Couldn't there be necessarily coextensive properties? And if we were basing our response to the coextension problem based on modal realism wouldn't have the ability to account for that. So are there such properties? Well, two possible examples would be the property of being Socrates and the property of being a member of the singleton set Socrates. So the property being Socrates, of course, just you are Socrates, and being a member of the singleton set. Now, in set theory, the idea is that there is a set for everything, and that includes a set for each individual thing. So there is a set that includes just this mouse, right? And that's a singleton set that is just this mouse. And there's a set that includes just this Topo Chico, and it's just that Topo Chico, that's the whole set. And if that's the case, then there is going to be a set that includes just Socrates. So in every possible world where Socrates exists, where the property being Socrates exists, the property, the singleton set of Socrates, being a member of the singleton set of Socrates also is going to exist. So necessarily coextensive. Or another example is the property of being triangular and being trilateral. So triangular means having three angles. Trilateral means having three sides, being a triangle, in other words. Right? Anything that has three angles has to have three sides, and anything that has three sides has to have three angles. And that's just as simple as it is. And that's going to be true across all possible worlds. So if an object exists in any possible world with three angles, it also has to have the property of having three sides, and vice versa. So those are some coextensive properties that are necessarily coextensive. So modal realism wouldn't be sufficient for those properties. Now, some philosophers, including in the book that I don't know where I put it, but the book that I've been using heavily, Sophie Allen's Critical Introduction to Properties, mention the possibility of impossible worlds. Like, why not throw impossible worlds into the mix where you could have a singleton set or you could have Socrates, the property of being Socrates, without the property of being a member of the singleton set Socrates, right? Maybe in this impossible world, there was no set, no singleton sets, what about those kinds of worlds? And again, if this were the case, then our necessarily coextensive properties would no longer be necessarily coextensive. You would have a world in which they are not coextensive, and therefore we could distinguish between the two properties, and we'd have two different properties. Personally, I don't think this is a legitimate argument, because the whole point of being an impossible world is that you don't exist, right? Impossible worlds can't exist by their very nature. So if we're talking about modal realism, where these possible worlds are out there and they're real, and we throw impossible worlds into the mix, then I think we've lost our way. Like, we're no longer talking about modal realism. So that's really all I'm going to say about impossible worlds. But another interesting response that you could have here is to question whether these are really even properties in the first place. So, for example, having a heart and having a kidney, or being trilateral and being triangular, are those legitimate properties? Having a heart is a relational property. And what do I mean by that? It's a relation that somebody has to his heart, or she has to her heart. It's not something that is like the property of being brown or property of being 6'2" or something like that. So some philosophers will say these relational properties don't count as properties, right? They're not true properties, so they wouldn't count in our counterexample as coextensive properties. And the same would go for being triangular and being trilateral. Being triangular would be a relational property that an object has to its, did I say trilateral? I can't remember which one I said. Trilateral would be to its sides, triangular to its angles. So we could object that we're out of the realm of actual properties, so these don't count. An interesting problem is, like, if we do so, things get a little complicated in our semantics. Our semantics means like what makes words mean what they mean. The easiest way to look at things would be to say that, hey, every time we have something that looks like a property, it's referring to a class, right? And we're going to use that to talk about all things that look like product, basically all predicates. All predicates just point to classes of things, and then that's very simple. But now if we're going to come along and say, well, but not these guys, right? Being triangular does not count as a class. Well, why not, right? And not to say that you couldn't, but to say that we now have to explain what makes it different than the other predicates and what makes it true, right? If it doesn't have a class that goes along with it. So all of a sudden our semantics has gotten a little bit complicated, but it's still a possible response that, is totally legitimate. It just would be a little bit more complicated. So it's an interesting question. Are these legitimate properties or not? I think that question is super interesting to me because you can have these fake properties. Like, I probably have mentioned it before, but the property of GRU being green before 1995 and blue after 1995. I can't remember what the year was, but there are objects that this is true for. If you say like berry is GRU, right? Berry is an object that was green before 1995 and blue after 1995. That would be true of some object berry, but that's obviously not a real property. That's something that we just came up with. But then there seem to be real properties too, properties that you can't just make up in your head. So what's the difference? Like where can we draw the lines? Where do we cut nature at its joints, as Plato says? Which is a fascinating question to me. But I'll leave that to you guys to consider. Is it the case that being triangular and being trilateral are not real properties? Is it the case that having a heart and having a kidney are not real properties? Does the coextension problem work, or is it based off a pack of lies? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next video. Adios.